This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl BK here, and join with me is my amazing, spectacular co-host, Jack Manley. How you doing, Jack?
I'm doing really well today, BK. Honestly, I'm hoping you're feeling as excited as I am to do this episode, because this is a momentous occasion, in my opinion, for the podcast.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we really are tackling something that we've never done here on Revenge of the Film Nerds. And quite frankly, I'm proud of ourselves and cannot wait to dive into this discussion because, Jack, you have proposed one of the most interesting films, I have to say, of at least this season.
We are finally about to inaugurate our podcast's journey into the world of documentaries. And I thought, what better way to start than with Barbara Kopple's 1976 classic, the observational documentary, Harlan County, USA. And BK, you said it was an interesting pick that I made here, and I have to agree with you, because even as somebody who has seen this documentary and knows the impact that it has upon its viewing, when we went and watched it again, it shocked me, quite frankly, how this stuff played out. And I don't know if I was prepared for the emotional journey it took me on.
No, honestly, absolutely not. And I'm a girl who enjoys an occasional documentary. I think everyone does at this point. I mean, everyone and their mom has watched a handful of true crime ones. It's like super popping out there right now. So I think we all are aware of what documentaries are, or a typical one. But Harlan County, USA was unlike any documentary I really have ever seen, Jack.
It's got a juicy subject for audiences to take in. It's about the fact that in June 1973, the coal miners working for the Brookside Mining Company in Harlan County, Kentucky, signed and ratified a union contract with the UMWA, the United Mining Workers Association. And they signed with this union in protest of their pay, their living conditions, and the lack of safety on the job. But in response, the Brookside Mining Company, a subsidiary of Duke Power, refused to recognize this contract, which resulted in a year-long strike by the miners, during which the community would organize both in support of the union and against the union, which kind of tore apart an isolated corner of rural Appalachia in a deeply personal conflict. So it's a subject that has a lot of resonance to it in the way that it views a small community involved in a very big struggle.
I'm honestly so glad that we did this, because me and you, Jack, we're here, we're often, and we like to champion, I don't know, highlighting stories of specifically underrepresented groups when we get the chance. And by God, one, I am astounded I didn't know about what was going on over in this corner of the world, but quite frankly, overwhelmed by the opportunity to learn about the struggle and learn about what was done against that struggle. And that is what this film is. So, Jack, hands down, you did a solid in picking this film. Now, I'm curious, why choose this one out of all the docs out there, all the things you could have put me on a history track? Was there something about this that stood out to you, or what made this come up so quickly when you were like, documentary, yes, this is the one?
Well, first off, and you know this is my co-host and my family and friends all know this, but I am a borderline insufferable history buff. It is a subject that occupies an inordinate amount of my time. And in particular, actively learning as much about America from as many lenses as I can is something I like to do. And I love to do that particularly through documentaries. They're a big part of my life when I'm not watching the type of stuff that we talk about on the podcast typically. So when the opportunity came to put a documentary on our schedule, I was so excited to watch Harlan County because it is such a raw and honest depiction of a real-world event. Honestly, the type of which would probably lie below the radar of most people if a filmmaker did not specifically take it upon themselves to show the events that unfold. In my opinion, it's very close to the platonic idea of a documentary film. While there are definitely biases and a viewpoint present in the film, the events documented do not bludgeon you with a stance or an agenda. Instead, it's all about letting you view the turmoil of the unfolding strike as a fly on the wall. Honestly, it's a very human drama that these people are struggling through in a local community and being torn apart by. When you add that to the gripping narrative and the harsh truths that the film lays bare about the fight between unions and management, you have the makings of a very special film and something that you kind of have to share with people.
I'm so glad you brought up what lens this film really shows, because again, I can't stress this enough to like all of our film nerds out there and myself. When I'm speaking about this, is when I think documentary, this is not what I think. I'm so used to what you taught me when we were having our viewing, is that there is a specific type of documentary that people are often a part of or, exposed to, versus whatever this is an entirely different one. And then there are more. When I was watching this with you, Jack, I quite frankly was astounded that I did not know there were this many different versions or forms of documentary, and didn't know that I really haven't seen many of them. I've only seen one type.
Well, honestly, BK, I don't think you're alone in the fact that you have seen only one, maybe two types of documentary film, because Harlan County is what's known as an observational documentary, and really it's the rarest form of the three central types of documentary film. Now, BK, I hope you don't mind me taking everybody to film school really quickly, but what you're used to seeing is probably what is known as the expository documentary.
Okay, I am ready, Sensei. Teach me right now. So expository, if that's what I know from documentaries, I'm thinking person in interview chair, talking, maybe some text, a narrator. Am I right?
There's a real sense of a framework and a narrative at play. These are documentaries that have a thesis or a specific story about a person, place, or event, and then you're guided through that by a narrator or through direct interviews, but there's always a very explicit viewpoint or bias that is on display. It's not hard for the viewer to parse that out. And it's stuff that you watch that's like Ken Burns' work, or March of the Penguins, or the Last Dance documentary about the Chicago Bulls. It's an easily digestible form that doesn't hide its argument or hide its viewpoint. And that's something that's also taken to an extreme with the participatory documentary, which honestly, BK, you've probably seen a couple of these too.
Participatory. I don't like that word. Participatory. I'll participate. Oh my gosh. Okay, so like the camera person, the director, are they like involved in the story, man? Are they someone who like talks from behind the camera?
Actually, BK, in a participatory documentary, the filmmaker is actively in front of the camera.
Oh.
So the participation comes from the fact that, like Michael Moore in Roger and Me say, they have a crucial point in building and constructing their narrative, and also allowing their bias as a person to influence the filmic journey. This has even become, in recent years, an offshoot type of documentary known as the reflexive doc, in which the filmmaker themselves is the primary subject. Think stuff like Super Size Me.
Super Size Me. Oh my gosh, that's the one with the guy who ate a lot of Super Size meals and he got really heavy set, no?
Yeah, that's the one where the guy eats McDonald's for 30 days and sees what that diet does to his body as a means of talking about the junk food content that they put out there.
See, that's actually very smart. I can't believe I didn't gather more from it. Maybe it's the style of documentary. I don't know.
Well, really, these styles of documentaries are very ubiquitous, I think, because we end up putting the focus on the filmmaker and putting the focus on the argument or the story that they want to tell about a specific event. But that's only one real lens through which you can create documentary film, and it's kind of a passive lens compared to what observational documentaries are. Now, this is where we get into what Harlan County is. In an observational documentary, there is little, if any, narration. The filmmaker is not guiding you through a constructive narrative about an event through scripting a story. There are no real or very limited interviews. It's really just a camera in a live environment, and life is shot as naturally as possible in what is known as the cinema verite, or the fly-on-the-wall style of filmmaking. It's something that is very, very different in its approach because it allows you to do documentary filmmaking about events as they occur rather than as a reaction to events.
Oh, I'm actually desperately trying to figure out if I've ever seen anything else than what we saw here for the podcast, which is Harlan County, USA. I can't really think of that. I kind of really love that style. And the moment, Jack, when you explained it to me so eloquently while we were watching it, was really the idea of this notion of the fly on the wall. And I was like, that is brilliant, Jack.
Fly on the wall shooting is really a hallmark of this style because it allows you, as I mentioned, to tell these stories in real time. And so these documentaries deliver, I think, a different type of tension narratively. There isn't a narrative swell that is building up towards an event the way that an expository documentary centers itself around the most dramatic parts of an issue. In an observational documentary, big dramatic moments can deliver themselves on a scene-by-scene basis because real life doesn't follow the pacing of a film. It doesn't follow the natural beats that we understand in the way that a film story is told. And so it can really surprise you in the ways in which it conveys itself. And furthermore, in an observational documentary, the camera even affects people in a different way than other documentary films. In an observational doc, you see in real time the ways in which people alter their behavior or become performative when they realize that they're being filmed, often in a difficult situation. The audience watches the camera impact that behavior. And so it's a real lens, not necessarily into reality, but it's a very strong lens into filmed reality.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that was probably one of the biggest moments it happens in the film where someone definitely is not happy about the camera in them, or there are other moments where you catch like random people on the street like looking at the camera being all like, what are you doing here? And the only thing I can think of is it akin to a lot of, I don't know, maybe reality TV things, like, you know, on the street reporting things of that nature. I can't really point to specific series in my brain. I know I'm sure anyone listening probably has a few of those that come to mind. The only thing I can think of that is mainstream is something like The Office, but clearly that's parody, like clearly that's scripted with some improv. This is raw people, real life issues, quote unquote controversial situations. I say quote unquote because to me it's pretty obvious where the disparity lies, but I really, really loved and was drawn towards the observational side of documentary. And Harlan County, USA is a great way to kind of bring you in that. And the version we watched on HBO Max had a nice little primer from our director herself, really talking about what brought her into that world and why she wanted to even make a documentary. And I think it's the same kind of similar or adjacent story that people who make documentaries have or want to do. There's some sort of drive behind these documentary folk that I feel like I am resonating with and I want to absorb, Jack.
I think that's only natural because realistically, people have been interested in making documentaries since film was film. Ever since the Lumiere brothers were literally filming trains coming into stations in what were known as actuality films, we have been shooting events in real life trying to capture the majesty and often the mundanity of living life on screen. We use documentary as both a means, I think, of understanding society the way that we do in Harlan County and the way that we watch their struggle. But we also use documentaries and have a deep tradition of using them for escapism. I mean, when the form originated in the early 20th century, we had scenic films, which were about traveling to faraway and exotic lands. But beginning with the work of Robert J. Flaherty, who's kind of the first documentarian, BK, we've always had this romanticism in documentaries about looking at subjects and looking at them earnestly. That part of the tradition has remained unchanged, So when you talk about your attraction to the observational style, maybe it's that focus on people is so deeply rooted in the art form.
I love that you've brought it there, because I think you're onto something. There is nothing more captivating than seeing a lens into a scene or someone's life or a moment in time. And you put it perfectly, where I can recall vividly in my mind images or clips of the most momentous occasions in history. I mean, I love the lens. I think that it's it. It's an uncut, raw look, a wholesome look. You had the better words, but that is it. And I can't think of a better film to kind of show that or convey that than this film. That's why I kind of swear by Harlan County, USA. But there have been a lot of other documentaries that existed and other topics that have been kind of, I don't know why I want to call it exposed as if they're hidden, but a spotlight has been shown on them. And I think that is something so fascinating about a documentary. So I'm curious, what's the journey of documentaries? How did we get to something as successful as Harlan County, USA? Has it always been that popular, or were there specific moments throughout film history that brought us to this place?
Well, I mentioned that Robert J. Flaherty, our first ever documentarian, showed up in the 1920s and started making films like Nanook of the North, which was really kind of where the expository form of this was born. But realistically, documentary filmmaking over the first half of the 20th century is this long journey of filmmakers understanding the impact that the documentary can actually have on its audience. It was something that was embraced, honestly, first by propagandists more than anybody. I mean, the dark side of documentary filmmaking is the fact that people like the Nazis were able to use it to dramatic effect to make themselves into a imposing image. While it would be used for good in places like the United States in World War II to push the propaganda effort to win that war against Nazism, it still showed that documentaries and presentations of reality and biases and viewpoints can be used and twisted to different purposes. So really the journey of documentary up until about 1950 is a struggle over understanding how viewpoint can be used. But it was in the 1950s, when the cinema verite style developed in France, that documentaries started to break free of propaganda and started to be more about reflections of real life, BK.
Okay, and now I'm putting it in my mind in history, because I said earlier I'm digging deep of random flashes of visuals, because that's how BK's brain works. I can vividly recall the moment you said it, propaganda, boom, I go, oh my God, all the war efforts, everything. I've watched documentaries on the documentative propaganda. That's not a word, but it is now. Documentative. To kind of see that it is, here come the French New Wave again, changing it and putting a spin on it and really bringing it back to the artistry and bringing it back into cinema is fascinating to find out. And it would be you, Jack, who puts that together for me.
Well, like I said, I'm an insufferable history buff. But I'm glad you bring up the fact that cinema verite comes from the French New Wave, because while the filmmakers who were working on narrative film in France at the time were using the fly-on-the-wall style to find new ways of examining interesting scenarios that they would develop for their characters, documentarians saw it as the opportunity to remove the filmmaker from the process, really, and to give viewers a supposedly unfiltered look at life and how it unfolds. It was very attractive to the French and their current film movement, but surprisingly enough, it was a style of documentary that took off in this era of America and was embraced by American documentarians for those same reasons. And it is into this world where Barbara Kopple really found her interest in filmmaking.
Wow. I mean, I think I'm following the footsteps of Barbara Kopple right now, literally right now, as you're telling me the truth and the history and the journey. Me and Barbara are about to be bros. And I'm finding out right now, homegirl grew up in Scarsdale, New York, Westchester in the building. Shut up, Jack. Shut up.
I was about to say, if you ever have any aspirations of doing observational documentary as a New York girl, Barbara Kopple is a pretty good archetype for you to follow.
I love that. I really, really do. And this is all super genuine because I can't begin to express how exciting it was to see a female in cinema and doing something so, I feel, could be considered, quote unquote, brave. But I don't think it's just bravery. I think it's smart intelligence and passion. It's not merely being willing to take a risk, but taking the risk to make a documentary is a task in itself. And to find out a female is behind the lens, I'm jazzed. I'm inspired, Jack. You've done it.
Well, the great thing for Barbara Kopple is that she was very much in the right place at the right time and worked with the right people. Because while she had an interest growing up in clinical psychology, and that's where her studies were focused at Northeastern University, those studies in clinical psychology sparked her love of filmmaking when she opted to make a film for one of her courses instead of writing a term paper. And when she did that, she realized, hang on, I am not necessarily interested in clinical psychology. I'm interested in telling people's stories and being exposed to their psychology through that lens. And this is also coincidentally around the same time that she becomes aware of the plight of the miners in Appalachia. And so all of this gets her to go to SVA for grad school to study to become a documentarian, and ultimately leads her into the world of observational documentary on kind of a chance encounter.
That's so funny. I really am starting to think that some of the greatest works are ending up being these either acts of chance or divine coincidence now. The gods sometimes genuinely shine down upon creatives. And Barbara Kopple, I think, had one of those moments.
There's no other way to look at it other than as a word we use a lot on this podcast, serendipitous. She was in a class one day at SVA, and one of her classmates mentions to her that she works for these people, the Maysles brothers, Alan and David Maysles, who are landmark observational documentarians. And she mentions that they're just finishing a film that could use some help. And when Kopple receives this request to possibly work on the film, she goes, "Yes, are you kidding?" She basically leaves that class and goes straight to work for some of the greatest documentarians of their age. She would even assist the Maysles brothers and female director Charlotte Zwerin on their landmark documentary, Salesman, as well as their iconic follow-up, the Rolling Stones documentary, Gimme Shelter. So she was in a crucible of filmmaking.
I mean, after that type of an experience, you kind of just know where you're going, I feel. I wouldn't know what to do if that were me. Maybe I do. Maybe I am Barbara. I would, start my own project.
I think the impetus to start the project is the right one, and it's one that Barbara was able to have when she started pre-production on Harlan County in 1972, because she ended up at a place that was, dare I say it, on the cutting edge of women's lib in the 1970s. Kopple even said of working there that the wonderful thing about working for Alan and David Maysles was that they were the first company that treated women as equals. Everyone attended all the meetings, everybody's opinion was important. So when Kopple starts developing her own project and starts her own company, Cabin Creek Films, she's doing so having had the opportunity to be taken seriously in a professional context as a documentarian. So even though she's only 26 when she starts working on this film, she is already extraordinarily knowledgeable on what she's doing.
I love to stand a skilled woman in her craft. And to hear that she has been around amazing creatives and has had a solid experience thus far, it really does set her up to be successful in her next venture. I'm curious, though, what kind of really was the driving edge to make her focus on what was going on in Harlan County?
Yeah, I'm guessing you picked up on the incongruity of the facts there. She starts working on this project in 1972, but the miners went on strike in 1973. So something had to spark her interest in the area beforehand. And what it was, BK, is that in 1969, the United Mine Workers Association had an unbelievably controversial and tragic union election that year.
See, this is all kind of new to me and vastly interested because I'm a working woman and I'm pro-union up in this piece. So it's news to me. Feel kind of stupid, but I should have known there's elections for these things. There's got to be a committee. Clearly there's organization. So when I'm finding about all these intricacies of the network, I was kind of blown away, Jack. I did not know it was this deep.
Yeah, absolutely. Unions are very political organizations, and they have all of the intrigue that you would expect from politics. What happened in 1969 is that the union boss, W.A. Tony Boyle, who had held the presidency of the UMWA for almost 40 years at that point, was being challenged for the presidency by a man named Joseph Yablonsky. And Yablonsky was a beloved, populistic leader within the miners who wanted to fight for more concessions from the industry compared to Boyle, who was largely seen as this corrupt puppet for political interests. And Yablonsky ends up losing the election, but it was an election that was largely seen and very largely suspected to be extraordinarily corrupt in order to give Boyle the victory. And so Yablonsky, in mid-December of 1969, asks the Department of Labor to step in and investigate the election. And the reaction, BK, is where this really becomes tragic, because Boyle responded by giving $20,000 to another union executive council member to hire miners sympathetic to Boyle to kill Yablonsky. And on New Year's Eve 1969, the entire Yablonsky family was murdered in their home.
Are you kidding me? I didn't realize. I should have realized. They were showing pictures of it was the whole house and everyone was pissed. I didn't realize it was the whole family. I thought it was crazy. Like, this is a hired hit. Get the man out of here. I don't want him running against me again. But this was cold-blooded. This was more than a threat. This was an actual execution. That's ridiculous.
The good news is, at very least, Boyle gets got. He was convicted in 1973 of hiring those killers. But before he was convicted, he was challenged for the presidency again in 72, this time by Arnold Miller and the Miners for Democracy, aided very strongly by Chip Yablonsky, one of Joseph Yablonsky's sons, who had not been present when the massacre happened. And they campaigned primarily on strengthening safety precautions against black lung. And so Kopple becomes interested because Miller wins this election, and Kopple wanted to see whether or not Miller was going to keep his promises to the miners on upping these safety standards. And so when the Brookside miners go out on strike in June 1973, she's obviously interested because it fits the narrative of striking for these safety precautions. But when she got to Harlan County, BK, she quickly realized that the Brookside strikers and their struggle was the most interesting story. And at that point, she moves to Harlan County with her crew of 5, and she takes out a $12,000 loan for the film's initial budget. And she becomes engrossed by the exact same story that we were engrossed by watching the film.
I mean, it makes sense. I'm just fascinated at 26. You're following this entire election situation that's happening not even in the state you're in. But I guess it was that big. Am I wrong, Jack?
Well, not only that, but Barbara Kopple also was a very politically minded woman from a very early age. When she was at Northeastern University, she really started her political involvement as a private citizen because she was very adamantly involved in anti-war protesting during Vietnam. During the same period when she was studying clinical psychology, I mentioned that she started to understand the plight of the Appalachian miners. She really got focused in on and very knowledgeable about labor struggles in America. So she was dying to tell a story about labor. She just had to find where the meat of that story was. And who would have thought that this happenstance of this strike starting just as she started to be interested in the film would offer her the opportunity to put all of these forces that she had had bubbling around in her mind onto screen. And honestly, BK, I think that this is the point at which we really need to dive into the meat of this film, because Kopple's enraptured at this point. We're enraptured by what we've seen. But I think it's important to discuss why the subject of Harlan County is so potent and what it does to really build itself as a very human drama.
It is definitely a human drama. I'm glad that you said it that way, because finding out, one, the story, learning the struggle, learning what's going on, being drawn there because of that reason, but almost essentially falling in love with the people in an area that is definitely unlike any place I have ever seen. I think we kind of have to bust it down on who the film is really about, because we've talked about Barbara, we've talked about why she did it, why she made it, what's interesting about it, but the film isn't about her. It's not about her at all. It's really about the common man and the miner, Jack.
I think Kopple even had a wake-up call about that when she started filming. You know, initially, the strikers were very, very suspicious of Barbara Kopple and her cameraman, Hart Perry. And it's not hard to see why. They kind of derided them as this hippie crew from New York who they thought might be trying to exploit their situation or take advantage of them to some degree. There was a period of real cooling between the strikers and Kopple before the story could be told. And she had to understand these people as people in order to tell that story earnestly. And it really crystallized at one moment when she confronted a striker who had been vociferous about the other strikers not talking to her. And when she asked him why he was so opposed, he looked at her and said, "Girl, you gotta tell the people what you're doing." And it was at that point Kopple kind of realized that if she was going to be responsible on this subject, she had to give credit to these people and give credit to the fact that the reason that they're so engrossing as the center of this narrative is because of the fact that they are an uncommonly intelligent and, I guess, charismatic people that live in Harlan County. There's an intelligence to the quote-unquote common man that is on display in this film that is just staggering, and Kopple had to step back to appreciate it.
Honestly, that theme right there is probably the biggest drive for me. Next to one we'll talk about later. But really what got me in, what intrigue really brought me into the story, was combating and battling my own stereotypes. Unbacked up stereotypes about who you think the miner is and the working man. And this is not the East Coast or the West Coast or what I know of the South. This is an area in America that I have no context for. And when I see it depicted out in the world, it's often depicted at a lower level. I assume below poverty line. I assume they'll never be able to own land. I assume they aren't smart. They don't have educations. They work with their hands. And immediately that was gone by seeing and witnessing how they are in their element and at the picket line. The people of Harlan County are people like everywhere else. They have passion. And I think this film also shows that that passion and that fire and that intelligence can be found throughout the world. I think that moment when some situation is going on in the film that requires them to promote more support for the union, Jack, I think you can give better clarity about that thread with what's going on when they're in New York City. But that scene right there is really what showed me that this film wanted to show the intelligence of the common man as a whole, and Harlan County was merely the lens.
Yeah, the scene in New York in which one of the striking miners is speaking to a police officer who is in turn telling him about the union that he has in New York City is really striking because, like, I'm glad that you bring up the poverty line when you're talking about this and when you're talking about disabusing people of their notions, because there is this stereotype that we have in America that education and wisdom are derived somehow from being more cosmopolitan, from being in a higher economic strata and having more access. And in this isolated corner of the country, ideas like that fail very quickly in the face of the Brookside strikers, their supporters, and some of their arguments. You know, they're not overly negative or fatalistic about what they're facing, but there is no ignorance about their situation either. They know what they're facing in the strike, the dangers of their work, and they're not trusting of any authority all that much. They don't rely on even those who support them all that much. They're really, really very aware. It's striking how perceptive and intelligent the striking miners are about their situation. More than their intelligence being displayed through a plan to win the strike through smart picketing techniques, there is an understanding of the politics at play behind the scenes. Both the politics compelling anti-union men and scabs to use aggression against them, and the politics their own desired union will wind up playing with bigger political fish. They know that they're going to have to fight and scrap for everything they get, and they think about that through a very political lens, and it just destroys any notion that you could have that because these people are in an isolated corner of Appalachia, that they're somehow yokels.
I can't even agree more. Honestly, I think it even goes a level higher, because I love that you mentioned how politically smart these people are, but there's something when it goes to becoming philosophically smart. It really is something to see how much these people care, not just to get the right person in office. They're not coming from a place of greed. They're coming for equality and to be treated like a person, to get the same level of respect and dignity in their workplace and support that they should get from their job. And I keep bringing up that scene in New York because it's New York, but it hits home. And now knowing that Barbara's from New York, it double hits home for me. But it's such a New York thing to talk about the union. As someone who grew up in Florida, where that is not commonly spoken, coming up in New York and having that conversation and hearing this and meeting New Yorkers, and New Yorkers being that person in my mind of when I think of someone who does fight for the union, who fights for those rights to be getting treated the same way and to get the benefits that are needed because of the hard work that they put in. So to see that kind of narrative in a different location where the circumstances of that area are drastically different, yet share a semblance in humanity, it just perpetuates the theme of this kind of shared experience or shared humanity that we've talked about on the podcast before, Jack. And I don't know, but once I started to get into that realm, I lost it. Did that theme resonate with you?
It did. And I think that something that is important to note that New York City and Harlan County have in common is that in New York City, one of the reasons unions have been so prevalent and so important is because in a city this large, they often form a real sense of community for the people who are involved in them.
Yes.
And that's a big, big point of emphasis in Harlan County. It's not that these people are bonded together because of their community or because of where they are. It is the union that bonds them together as a people. The miners go on strike in June 1973 specifically because they wish to join the UMWA and be recognized as part of the national union, as part of this national community. And the struggle comes from the fact that, I mean, yes, at a practical level, the company owners do not want to be beholden to the UMWA contract. But what plays out is the miners not just having to fight for improvements in safety or increases to their pensions, but for the right to be recognized as human beings and the right to have their community recognized as legitimate. The company has them stuck in, substandard squalor housing, often without running water, and they consider this to be a legitimate means of housing their employees. During the strike, scabs are allowed to drive their cars into striking miners at the picket with no repercussions. The strikers have to vehemently argue with the sheriff just to get them to arrest the villain of this film, Basil Collins, after he shoots at them. You really see them having to fight for the type of recognition that you think a community should just be given from a basic point of dignity. And the fact that they're not afforded the basic dignity of human beings means that they have to survive by relying on one another. And the solidarity of these people in providing for each other, in finding odd jobs for one another, in sharing resources, is what the real power of this union ultimately becomes. It isn't so much about the contract or the standards they're fighting for. It's that the union comes to represent the spirit and the soul of this community.
I'm so glad you brought up community, Jack. It's brilliant because that really is what it is. These towns, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these towns in these places that are run by these corporations, like a mining town, they pop up around the jobs, essentially around the union, and the culture and the community kind of builds from that. And you really start to see it when the strike begins in the film and how the community outside of the union is almost rallying behind the union in support. They really got the whole town together and then some to be able to combat the issues at hand and get their demands and make their asks with their company, which I feel should have been given to them in the first place. Like when you see how they work when you really get to see that footage there at the start of the film, Jack, that sets the stage, not in a dramatic way that you would think a documentary shakes someone, you start with a bang or something, but it slow walks you and brings you into the day-to-day life of the miner, and you literally go into the minds of this person, see how they do their job. It's not over dramatized. It's not bad. It is matter of fact, but still dangerous. I would never, in my right mind, Jack, opt to do a job like that. And these people do it well, and have a whole family behind it.
You could not get me kicking and screaming into a coal mine. I mean, you hear the plight of these miners mentioned again in New York when the guy is talking to the cop, telling him that somebody dies every day for that electricity. And that's the practical reality that these people go to work with. You see the realities and the carryover of what this lifestyle can do to you, laid plain not through being brutally overt with it, but just things like seeing the old timers at the Black Lung Clinic and seeing the struggles that they have just to draw breath. Coal mining, even without a striking situation where you have pro and anti-union forces pitted against each other, it's a violent kind of reality to live in. And so it's not a surprise that the violence of coal mining life reflects in the dire stakes that are on display in this film.
There are definitely dire stakes. Honestly, I probably should have had a content warning for it because of how, I don't want to say explicit because it doesn't have that connotation, but I can only think of the word raw. It depicts the life and the consequences of that life of a miner and how raw that is, seeing the Black Lung, seeing these elderly, and seeing the violence, Jack. There is violence in this. And often when we talk about standing up against injustices and fighting for known and inherent rights, it is always a conversation about nonviolence versus violence. And I really love tackling that subject with this film because the people of Harlan County, the miners, they really want to take and often do take tons of acts of nonviolence at every turn and are constantly met with violence, guns, and oppression in every manner.
It's a subject that Kopple herself would get a really, really strong sort of baptism into because she was regularly threatened. In addition to the strikers, she herself was regularly receiving threats from the Brookside mining owners during filming and basically was told directly, if we catch you alone at night, we'll kill you. And she was concerned enough about her safety to where she carried 2 pistols throughout the shoot. But really, people being armed was kind of the minority on the striking side of the action because guns in this film are kind of a crucial barometer within the film for showing how tensions between the strikers and the so-called gun thugs devolve over the course of the long strike. And you see for a long time, the strikers resist using the tools of their oppressor, the gun. And at first, really, nobody wants to overtly show the violence. The threats of violence are implied, but gun thugs like Basil Collins, when identified by the strikers, really attempt to conceal their firearms from the camera crew and only hint at their threats of violence through like an intimidating presence or casual jokes with each other about busting heads. But as the strike goes on, BK, and the pressure goes up for the Brookside Mining Company, the gun thugs get more cavalier about displaying their guns and openly throwing their weight around because it's known that they're armed. And this all culminates in the most famous scene in the film, in which Basil Collins shoots at the strikers on the picket line in the pre-dawn darkness, while another group of thugs beat Kopple and her cameraman for showing their use of violence. And I think, honestly, the scariest and most chilling part of that scene is at the end when Collins gives this order, essentially, of, you can let these people live now. And he does it not because there's any great care for the lives of the strikers or the filmmakers, but he does it because maintaining the threat of death and creating a situation in which gun thugs have the power of life and death over others is a way to psychologically oppress them. Violence is as much a psychological tool for the strikebreakers as it is a practical one.
Really, my takeaway from it was realizing the lengths in which people would go to continue and perpetuate the oppression. I feel like as a Black woman, I should know, but I watch it every second watching that film. I'm blown away at the audacity of what are they called? Scabs, they call them?
Gun thugs really are the ones who are the aggressors.
Right. I guess I thought they were using a terminology for those groups of people who were minors themselves. Imagine your effing coworker pulling up to you, striking, being like, hey, I'm trying to get better benefits for us. And he's like, yeah, check out my AK. Check out my AR-15. He's insane to me. And flexing it, being like, I'm going to do what I got to do because my boss is paying me off to do this. It's just, when you break it down that way, and being an adult now, it really hits and kind of opens your mind to realize that that was a real fight. And I don't think that fight has been won even.
Well, it's one of these things where it really is amazing that it even got to this point with the presence of the documentary crew, because it was noted throughout the strike that really the presence of Kopple and her camera had a cooling effect on a lot of these tensions, to the point where the crew would even pretend to be filming when they had no film to run, simply because it had a deterring effect on the violence. But even when that began to fail, it leads to this aftermath of the attack where there's a fierce debate of how to respond to this naked aggression. And this is where you see an incredibly substantive discussion of the community on the subject of violence versus nonviolence. Everybody wants to see a larger presence after this on the picket line to defend those who have been there regularly, but they're not sure how to keep themselves safe, and this issue splits a lot of them. Some, like Lois Scott, one of the miners' wives, who is arguably the most vociferous striker and the most eloquent striker on the picket line, keeps a gun in her bra, and she is ready to romanticize, as she puts it, fighting fire with fire and arming herself with the tools of the oppressor to create a force for defense. But there are still others who cite the fact that 40 years prior to this event, Harlan County had been on strike as well, and this is where it became known as quote-unquote Bloody Harlan County. This area of the country has a history of not just labor struggles, but violent labor struggles. Body counts in these struggles where miners and union busters alike were shot dead over labor struggles. And it's such a present reality of what these people are thinking about that even Norman Yarborough, the head of the Brookside mine, is acutely aware of the violence of the 1930s and desperate to avoid it. So you see the situation where there is a staggeringly mature debate within the community and in the film about how we view guns and how we struggle to understand the toll of violence as something with the potential to happen versus it being something that has happened or that does happen. You have to contextualize it in real time. And while the miners do present firearms in a counteraction that results in the arrest of Basil Collins, they ultimately refuse to use them as more than a symbol. They do ultimately reject the violence of their oppressors while showing that they understand violence as a symbol.
I love your articulation on that. That's definitely how I felt when the strikers started wanting to fight fire with fire and choosing violence. We've heard that struggle countless times. I mean, in the words of Malcolm X, right? So we know that sometimes violence might be an option or could be a choice, but there is a distinction here. And it is interesting to see that the strikers really didn't choose to go out guns blazing. It wasn't like they were out here beating up people or trying to make some sort of message. They weren't rioting, in a sense, destroying private property and doing things of that nature to make a point or to make something larger. They really steadfast and true to the picket line. Here's what we're going to do. We'll protect ourselves. We're going to arm ourselves. Really in a form of protest at that point. Like, to me, I know striking is protesting, but like there used to be a distinction in my mind. And here now there is none. Strike's just only the word when it involves your job, apparently.
It's a cruel irony that they have to use violence as a symbol, because what ends this strike ultimately is when gun violence actually takes the like of a young 23-year-old miner named Lawrence Jones, who is involved in the striking actions. This kid, this poor kid, gets shot in the head by a shotgun for the fact that he wanted to go out and strike for better rights and to be recognized as a human being. And it takes this actual outburst of violence that tears out the heart of the community in probably the most emotionally charged scene of the film, seeing this poor kid's funeral, and it's either his mother or his grandmother sees him lying in the coffin and breaks down with such a raw emotion that you are impacted by it as the viewer at a visceral level. It's a shame of the whole thing that guns become this parable of the whole struggle, because this outburst is what finally brings Brookside and the UMWA to the same table to sign the contract and to resolve the situation. It's sad because when the threat of violence goes from being a threat to actually carrying out an act of oppression, it pushes everybody to their breaking point. It's amazing to me that it's a moment where real life offers more symbolism than any film script ever can. It's awful that that has to occur in such a tragic way.
Really, I didn't know I was signing up for such a moving, impactful moment where you did get to see the raw emotion there in the funeral scene. I mean, poor Nana fainted, and I had to sit there and really contemplate and really digest what had happened, because everything is what we've been echoing is that it's a live lens. It's the closest thing to live that you can get of human experience, of live human experience. And how do I say this without getting emotional? I was not prepared to see someone be that emotionally impacted, but it makes sense. And it didn't just impact the family. It impacted everyone. It invoked change. And the film is so great at showing that progress and showing that fight back of the miner in Harlan County. And I think the most impactful thing, other than that scene, really, for me, was the use of the music throughout the entirety of the film. There was no other way Barbara could have presented how the miner actually feels other than the music that was chosen. I really can't stress that enough, because the music that was chosen was from the people. A lot of it was live. A lot of it was them expressing themselves and expressing the hardships and the struggles that they went through via song. And that is your soundtrack through all of this experience, is this raw lens into that experience. And the music just moved me, Jack.
I'm glad you've brought it here, because I do think the music is a crucial piece of context for this film in how it conveys emotionality and how it conveys the impact of the experience of going through this strike. And really, the music that's used is wonderful in part because Appalachia is a region of America where communities use music as a form of communication in a way that is kind of unique. These communities are often extremely isolated in the Appalachian Mountains and don't connect with the rest of the world or their conveniences or the luxuries. A lot of the stuff that we take for granted just isn't in these areas and in these underserved communities. And because of that, music and singing has a very sacred emotional quality in the way that it conveys the struggles of this life, the way that it tells the Appalachian experience, tells stories, conveys difficult emotions, even just breaks up the monotony of not having a lot to do or not having a lot of ways to express yourself in these communities. And so the people of Appalachia as a culture are extremely musical in their style of communication. And because this pointed tradition of musicality exists in that region of the world, coal mining communities in particular have developed music and songs that directly speak about the struggles of their lives, and in a very pointed, emotional way, really put a focus on the way in which they have been beaten down and underserved. It's a vital part of Harlan County, USA's narrative, to the point where you and I realized about 5 minutes into the film simultaneously that we were so lucky to have these subtitles on, because they tell you exactly what the song being played is and what it's saying, and you realize that the lyrics and the ways that the songs go, whether it's "Which side are you on," "Way down in the mine," "Woe, death," like all of these songs undergird the human drama at play and give musical context to the story in a way that even narrative films, even musicals, don't have an ambition to do. It is music used to be an earnest reflection of the way that these people pour their hearts out in this struggle. It's a different way of viewing music than any film really you'll ever see.
It really is a language, music. I am attest to that. I'll swear by that. But in this film, it is. And I think that's why I love it so much. And it's so well thought through, so well communicated. And knowing what you said about the people and what music means to those people, it really did become, in a way, their weapon. They had mantras, they had songs that brought them to that picket line, that rallied everyone together and really kept this going on for months and months. I mean, it was 10 months in, Jack, when we were watching it. I think it was 10 months. It was like the strike has been going on. And I was like, 10 months is a long time to not work. And you were just like, you haven't seen nothing yet. Like, the movie hadn't even popped yet at that point. And I'm sitting here like, 10 months? That takes tenacity, vigor, and dedication. And music really fueled a lot of that forward.
Well, not only that, but we have to mention, because you've mentioned the length of the strike, and this was a struggle that went on for a full year. The staying power of this strike, I have to be honest, BK, was almost certainly not the miners themselves, but the miners' wives and the women of the community who have people in their families who are going to the mine, or even to the point where people are concerned about their future sons going into the mine. And really, it's the long-term thinking of the women in this community that keeps them bonded together.
Jack, I'm so glad you went off on that, because it really was the women that were the anchor of this strike out here in Harlan County. And I really feel like I've got to give some credit to a woman being behind the lens to be able to see that, want to shine light on it, and tell the truth of it, and not depict it in any way but what it really is. And women ran that piece. Like, I can't stress it enough. Getting people organized, putting their lives on the line, and really being the force for the men to get in gear. Between all the back and forth of going between the filming and the strike going on for over a year, and all the results that are unfolding, seeing the women still be that fuel throughout that was phenomenal, to the point where there are the men being like, if the women can put their lives on the line and be out there every day and get behind our cause, we need to show up 10 times more than them. The pressure was there, but from the nicest and most wholesome way possible, about giving your all for the ones you love. And I really can't think of the most feministic thing ever. I feel like that is really what it means to be a woman here, getting a little emotional and a little introspective, but really women give their all for the ones that they love here. And it is seen that with women here at Harlan County being a driving force throughout all of this. Like, I really don't know if the women hadn't have stepped up or had been so confident in themselves and surefire of their beliefs and the power that they held. I don't know if the strike would have come to fruition.
I think you're right to be emotional here, because if you're somebody who supports feminist struggles, although we mean the inclusive feminist struggles because we don't play with turfs or swerves here on the podcast, in an era of women's lib in the 1970s, where people like to be derisive of the progress women made, where, you know, the most common thing brought up is quote-unquote bra burnings and the kinds of political overt protests you would see, dare I say it, this is quite possibly one of the biggest achievements driven by women during that era. Am I wrong?
I have to agree with you. I think it's really, really fascinating to learn about this and to see the context and history. You being the history buff and giving me my parameters to put the things that I know in a timeline. It's like my brain is finally getting the MCU timeline with like real world events.
And also, I want to mention, because you brought it up, it is important to underscore that to bring these women to the screen and to bring this mining struggle and this strike to the screen, Barbara Kopple went through her own struggle in producing it as well. You know, I mentioned she takes out a $12,000 loan for the film's initial budget, but this became a 4-year project of shooting and editing and going back and forth between New York City and Harlan County, because they had to raise this extra money in an independent way for a very small documentary film. While this was going on, Barbara Kopple was working on grant proposals. She was taking odd jobs on other films just to make that budget so she could get her way back to Harlan County. She was getting money from friends and family to finance the film. She was putting debt on her credit card and putting herself in massive financial straits just to bring this picture to the screen. It was that important to her as a project. And I think that is... We've talked about a lot of really striking efforts by filmmakers on this podcast to bring their visions to the screen and the efforts they took. But Koppel's kind of stands on its own here as a self-determined and independent filmmaker, a woman in the era of women's liberation, fighting like hell to make sure that this story sees the light of day.
That is the icing on the cake for me, Jack. Learning so much about Barbara Kopple and what she did for this film really, really has given me a newfound respect for the work itself. It's really a testament to dedication and putting not just your career on the line, but your life on the line. And really, Barbara kind of lived the story in a sense, not only just being there to experience it, but kind of standing behind the idols or the motivation that the women that she was observing really had by doing whatever she can and putting her life on the line for the story to be told. It's gotten a lot of critical acclaim. I mean, it is on HBO Max. This wasn't a flop. This wasn't, oh, risk it all, almost lose your life, and the documentary never sees light of day. I'm curious, what is the story upon release? I know there were some edits, but it wasn't really crazy on the cutting room floor, was it, Jack?
Other than the fact that it took 4 years to cut, I mean, that was really where the struggle lay. And part of that is just down to the fact that the documentary form is like that. While shooting ratios on narrative films are much more tight and much more efficient, on a documentary, you will shoot hundreds of hours of footage just to get a minute or 5 minutes of film onto the screen. You have to capture a lot, but it was a worthwhile process because it is released to massive critical acclaim. At that point in time, it got one of the longest standing ovations at the New York Film Festival when it debuted in October 1976. And it would go on to win the Best Documentary Feature at the 1977 Academy Awards, which Coppola would accept on behalf of the miners of Harlan County, who took us into their homes, trusted us, and shared their love with us. But as a kind of an interesting knock-on, Kopple stepped away from documentaries for 14 years after Harlan County. Something was really spent by her working on this. And while she would return to documentary film in 1990 with American Dream, which is about another strike, the 1985-86 Hormel food strike, she really was taken away from the art form for a while. And I can see why, with a film as charged and an experience as dramatic as what she went through on Harlan County to make that film see the light of day.
Yeah, you said that really nicely. I would say anything that almost risked my life, I got pretty much assaulted, I could have been shot. You got to take some time off. You got to step away. Not to mention the film not being done for 4 years. You didn't get that closure till the film was out and released. But 14 years is a very long time. It definitely is a testament to how impactful that was and how draining and how emotional it was. I can't imagine people living in Harlan County, what they went through in the years following, processing the events that have transpired, as they were the ones who were doing the very protesting themselves. So I got to give a little love to everyone involved in the project, because that must have been such, one, a moving experience. I know I've said that a lot in this podcast, but really it is. But two, such an empowering and exhausting thing at the same time.
And we see at the end of the film what the reality is going to be for these miners moving forward. Their union contract isn't what they need it to be. They need to fight for more rights and scrap for more rights. So we know that there will be more strikes, and these people will continue to value themselves and understand their need for solidarity and the need for their union. And their community will continue to be bonded through that. And I think it's why the rare criticisms of this documentary ring a little bit hollow for me, BK, but believe it or not, there are some people who have criticisms for this film.
Really? I guess it's a good point that you said that at the end of the film, it does give you those buttons, a little bit of text telling you what has gone on through the political union situation. And it does leave you lingering, thinking that the fight isn't over yet. When we say we don't know the future, we don't know if we'll get those demands or what that future may hold, but we do know that they're going to keep fighting for it. And that does sound pretty charged to me. And isn't this supposed to be an observational documentary?
I mean, it's charged, but I mean, those little crucial pieces of context are good to have because it lets you understand what the plight is going to be. But that does kind of fold into what the criticism of this film was, is that some critics were unhappy that it was only the miners' perspective that is expressed, and that the strike was only seen through the miners' eyes. And I gotta be honest with you, BK, I don't see that really as a legitimate criticism of documentaries, because even with an observational documentary, I think this needs to be beaten into people's heads. Documentaries are not a distillation of truth. As much as we would like them to be, every documentary has a viewpoint. And every documentary has an innate bias, and that is something that you have to accept about the art form. Like, yes, they can show us snippets of reality or filmed reality, but if you show people's perspectives on their own reality and make them the focus of a film, those perspectives are going to shine through on what is on the screen and impact the viewpoint of the film. And moreover, BK, we can see this on film. The anti-union gun thugs had every opportunity to be filmed and interviewed, and many were. They are the ones who chose to close themselves off from the crew and to close themselves off from being understood. It's an observation you made when we were watching it that I'm struck by in retrospect, but they made themselves the villains. They actively chose to become the villains of this piece. Kopple didn't need to do that for them. The camera crew didn't provoke them into doing that. The camera crew didn't tell Basil Collins, hey, it'd be really great for our documentary if you would shoot at these people on the picket line. Those were their conscious choices of how they wanted to represent themselves. So, dislike the documentary if you don't like unions, sure. Dislike the documentary if you're disappointed that you didn't get the viewpoint that you were expecting. But don't go into a documentary film expecting it to be some pure distillation of what reality actually is. Every documentary has a bias and an argument at its heart. They always will. And just because the observational form puts that bias into the edit doesn't mean that it's a detraction from what it's trying to say. End rant.
No, but go off. It is a great point. It is so important. You can't just take the facts, put it on a screen. Even if you read a book, you're never going to get straight facts. What do you want, a spreadsheet? What do you want, numbers? It is ridiculous for people to be upset, to be like, hey, this is only through the eyes of the miners. I think, taking as someone who plays video games, I mean, that was our entry point into the world. Or that's where we spawned, was with the miners. The other, quote unquote, other side, I've been doing a lot of quotes here today, but the other side didn't want it. There's multiple opportunities where they refuse to answer, feel uncomfortable for expressing their viewpoint. I wonder why. So I'm really glad you went off on that. And I'm really, really, really glad that we got to check out this film, because, Jack, I think I kind of want to make an observational documentary.
I think it's something that you should consider. And there are filmmakers like Frederick Wiseman, the godfather of the observational form, who I would like to point you to, because it is incredible work that puts a focus on an issue in a way that a lot of stuff that is expository just kind of can't. And I think the reason I get so charged about this one in particular is that it does feel personal to me as a North Carolinian. I feel a personal investment in this because of the fact that Duke Power owns Brookside Mine, and it is a North Carolinian company that is handling the oppression of these miners. It's personal to me because I have family members who have worked in labor mediation and have tried as hard as they can to bring both sides of a struggle to the table and to draw out good deals for unions and for companies alike, to try and find middle ground. So I've grown up in a family that respects the existence of both parties rather than trying to deny the existence of either. And it's something where, I have spent time in the Appalachian Mountains. I mean, in North Carolina, depending on where you grow up, you're no more than 3 or 4 hours from some of these communities. And you see the destitution, and you see the way that these people live, and yet you see the strength of these people shine through, and you see the uniqueness of these Appalachian communities. And it's something that I feel a strong connection to from where I grew up and from what I've seen. And so Harlan County is more than just a documentary for me. It is an expression of all of these forces and all of these political thoughts and leanings that I have had to discuss and cognate as a person through the course of my life, and positions I've had to learn about, and perspectives I've had to learn about, and biases I've had to learn about. And I appreciate the fact that I see something so resonant to me depicted in this way. I don't think that this strike or this struggle could have been done better justice by making the film any other way than the way it's made.
That was moving, learning your connection to this film and hearing you pull from your experience from where you grew up and hearing how you resonated with it, because we do come from different lifestyles, but we also have a lot of similarities. So I always take joy in hearing your take and learning more about you. And I guess I hope our listeners and film nerds do too.
An emotional end, talking about a deeply emotional film. I don't know if we could have gotten here to the end of the podcast in any other way, but excited that we've had probably the most important, pivotal, heavy film we have to talk about now. It's out of the way. We've talked about it. We can finally get to something that I think it's about a different struggle that I don't think you get in Harlan County. And I'm excited for you to tee up this film because it's a modern film that I was surprised to see you put on the list.
Yeah, you were genuinely surprised about my pick when I suggested that we try a different genre of film. And that is, we're going to be taking a look at the 2021 movie Tick, Tick, Boom, directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda. You'll know him, yes, from Hamilton, Encanto. And in his directorial debut here, Lin-Manuel decided to choose to make a biographical musical that is based off of an actual autobiographical musical that has been written by the amazing composer from New York, Jonathan Larson. You would probably know him most famously from his work from Rent. But we are not watching Rent, Jack. We're not doing it.
That's why I was confused, because the way I understand it is Larson and his work is very pivotal to shining a light on what Rent is really about, which is the AIDS crisis and the ways in which the gay community was marginalized and demonized during that struggle. And I thought to myself, well, hey, Rent tells the story of this struggle. But I guess, if we're watching Tick, Tick, Boom, there must be some reason that we're not doing Rent first.
Yes, I really thought, especially after coming off of something that's a documentary or whatever, let's give a musical a breath of fresh air, but give a musical that is grounded in reality and is, again, a different type of look. It is biographical. It is a musical about a person that actually existed and his life. And I've never seen a musical that is done this way. It isn't done this way. It's always usually a story or about something, not really about a person who's contemporary who happens to make musicals. It breaks a lot of fourth walls in a way and is starring an amazing actor. We've got deets on things, but Andrew Garfield, and his performance is phenomenal. So this is why I want to watch it, and I wanted to bring something new to the table. Don't get me wrong. We are gonna be watching Rent. It is gonna be in there. But I'd be remiss to not give us the story of the creator himself before we dive into Rent, which is impeccable. But Jonathan Larson and his relationship to his work is so important to appreciate and to understand how close and how much of himself he puts in it. So Tick, Tick, Boom does a phenomenal job with displaying him and his life before we get to see something that is his work on screen. And I think that that is the way I want the film nerds to learn about some of my favorite musical bits. So I'm really excited, Jack, to share it with everyone.
Gotta say, you're selling me on it a little bit. I think that it's kind of interesting how the idea of this bookends a little bit with All That Jazz, a musical that is completely centered on a fictional man. But I'm excited now. I can't wait to see what we're going to get into next week. But I think it is about high time that we cap off this one, because we have led people through a journey today, and it's about time we let them off the emotional hook.
Oh, you're totally right. Honestly, we could go on and on when it involves things with such amazing themes and just great work, as per usual here on the Film Nerds. We love to chat, but we don't want to keep you for too long. Plus, we've got to work on some other fun stuff in the pipeline. But if you want to talk to us, let us know what you are excited for, what episode has been your favorite so far as we approach the new year, and what you're looking forward to for our season 3 or any suggestions. You can always hit us up at Twitter at RFN_podcast or on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. We're working on coming back and swinging some more social media rollouts, some more Discord events. Follow us on Twitter. You can know when we are doing all the things. We're trying to do more watch parties and share more film selects or road screenings with the community so we can watch movies and be film nerds together. So we appreciate y'all so much for listening and always supporting us here on Revenge of the Film Nerds. Jack, did you have a good time today?
I had a great time. I'm just spent.
I am very spent too. And I hope you all had a lovely day listening to us. And we can't wait to bring you a spicy new pick for next week. That is Tick, Tick, Boom. Until then, y'all, we'll see you around.
Take care, everybody.